videos are going to be talking about Ronald Reagan's presidency, but also before he becomes president, we'll talk about the rise of the modern conservative movement, because you can certainly make the argument that as far back as certainly Nixon, there was definitely a rightward push. So one of the essential questions I want us to consider throughout these slides is to what extent was the conservative revolution already underway before Reagan took office? And we're going to be looking at that over the next few slides. So, was the Reagan Revolution essentially underway already? Maybe we shouldn't call it the Reagan Revolution then. Maybe we should just call it a conservative revolution. So let's give a little bit of background about who Ronald Reagan was before he became president, and then we'll go a little bit farther back in time and look at some of the previous Republican presidents and just some of the general conservative ideologies that are arising moving towards the 1980s. So Ronald Reagan was pretty old when he became president. As you can see, he was born way back in 1911. And he was active in politics from a fairly early age. He actually was a Democrat earlier in life. When he was in his 20s, he was a New Deal Democrat. He supported FDR, and he also campaigned for Harry Truman in 1948. But in the 1950s, when the Red Scare starts, we see that he does make a turn more in the conservative direction. He starts an acting career in his young adulthood, and one of the most significant indicators that he is moving to be more conservative is that he becomes very active in the Screen Actors Guild, which was a union for actors. And when he becomes president of the Screen Actors Guild, he actually basically steps up to the front lines during the really dark days of the McCarthy witch hunts. And he is one of the major figures who is trying to hunt down potential communists in the Hollywood industry. And he also takes a really strong stand against union action. So again, sort of the growing threat of socialism, communism in the movie industry in particular, and just the general Red Scare craze made Ronald Reagan much more conservative. So in the 1950s, he switches from being a Democrat to being a Republican, and he becomes even more conservative throughout the 1950s. He actually campaigns for Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, and then ever since then we see that he really emerges as a prominent conservative, making his own presidential bid in 1960 for the first time. So let's go back further in time and think about the ways in which the conservative ascendancy may be starting as early as the 1930s, even if conservatives don't actually regain the White House until the 1950s. So one example, if we go all the way back to the New Deal, remember that FDR was not 100% supported in his New Deal reforms, right? There were a lot of people that criticized FDR in the 1930s of being a socialist during the New Deal itself. This cartoon here shows us a criticism that ultimately FDR was undermining the principles of the Constitution itself with some of his New Deal reforms. So when it says, I am determined that under the Constitution these things shall be done, again, it's the idea that he's actually squashing the Constitution in order to try to institute reforms. We also see this with things like packing the Supreme Court, the idea that he's actually sort of going beyond, arguably, his constitutional boundaries as president. We also see, of course, when Eisenhower becomes president in the 1950s, he takes on not a fully turn towards more of a Reagan-style conservatism, but he certainly is straying a little bit away from more leftist politics. So when Eisenhower takes on the modern republicanism stand, remember that means that he still maintains some New Deal programs, so he's still maintaining some government spending, but he also is committed to balancing the budget. So we will see some cuts in some federal programs, things like healthcare and education, for example, under Eisenhower. And then in 1964, we see Barry Goldwater run for president, and he was a very conservative senator. And his campaign, even though he loses to Johnson, he starts to really epitomize what conservatives were advocating. So first off, he opposes significant government activism. He also opposes Social Security, which was a major New Deal accomplishment. He also opposes federal civil rights laws, not necessarily ones at the local or state level, but he's opposed to things like the busing that took place after the Brown v. Board decision. So he feels that civil rights are matters that should be taken on by the states. And this is a clear indicator that we're moving more in a conservative direction, because conservatives tended to support a system of federalism, which was where states had much more power to enact policy, not the federal government. And he also is taking more of a ardent Cold War stance, and that he wants more of a military buildup to defend against a Soviet attack. So this is definitely showing us that there is a prominent presidential contender who is moving more in this conservative direction as early as the 1960s. And also Barry Goldwater opposed the Great Society reforms of President Johnson, right, which were sort of seen as an extension of the New Deal. So he felt that the Great Society was an overextension of the needs that the government should or could meet. Other examples of conservatism emerging during this period. First off, we have, despite the fact that we tend to associate the youth generation with the counterculture movement of the 1960s, you do have a conservative youth organization formed in the 1960s as well. It was called the Young Americans for Freedom. We see them protesting here. So the Young Americans for Freedom show us that there was a contingent of the youth generation who was moving more in a conservative direction. You are going to see these people emerge as more pro-Vietnam and more in favor of cutting some of the substantial New Deal-like government spending programs. And then you see an emergence of some other conservative figureheads, people like William F. Buckley, who we see down here. William F. Buckley was not a politician, but he was a prominent conservative author and commentator, and he founded a magazine called the National Review in 1955, and this was a prominent conservative magazine, and so we get a sense that there is a greater conservative voice in the 1950s and 60s. Barry Goldwater, as we already mentioned, the 1964 Republican presidential candidate. And also we're going to see that increasingly Southern Democrats start to turn in a more conservative direction. Some of this is because they feel sort of disillusioned by the civil rights legislation that was passed in the 1960s. And what we're going to see is that in particular, Richard Nixon is going to start to court Southern Democrats and increasingly get them to vote Republican in the elections of the late 1960s and 1970s. And then you also see some extreme conservative societies emerging. So one good example of that was the John Birch Society. This was seen as a very ultra-conservative organization. They opposed civil rights. They actually believed that there were communists that existed in the civil rights movement. They supported the impeachment of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, who was the presiding Chief Justice over decisions like Brown v. Board. They write a magazine that's called The New American, and they argue that it was essential news for freedom-loving Americans. And also the John Birch Society was founded by Fred Koch, who was the founder of Koch Industries, and we now know Koch Industries as the organization that is run by the Koch brothers, who were prominent donors to super PACs that help campaign for conservative candidates. Some people link the John Birch Society to the modern Tea Party movement as well. So more extreme, an organization that mainstream Republicans like Ronald Reagan were less inclined to support. Richard Nixon also shows us a move more in the conservative direction, so far before Reagan. So for example, one of the things that Nixon does is he starts to trim some of the social welfare programs of the Great Society. He does not cut them altogether, however. Okay, so some of the things that Nixon does hold on to, for example, he is still in favor of some executive agencies that help promote the rights of workers. So he establishes an organization called OSHA, or the Office of Safety and Health Administration. And OSHA in general was meant to maintain safe and healthful working conditions. So to make sure that people had time for breaks, for example, to inspect the safety conditions of a workplace environment. To very explicitly state minimum wage requirements, what constitutes overtime, and so on. Right, so OSHA is an important example of Nixon not fully cutting federal government programs. Also, he establishes the Environmental Protection Agency, which is, again, an example that he doesn't totally cut federal spending or federal programs. And it's also interesting because we may not necessarily associate a Republican president with environmental reform, but nonetheless, it was Nixon who ultimately who ultimately created this agency. But one of the things that Nixon does that seems to be more conservative is that he was a huge proponent of a federalist system, or new federalism, which means that he wanted to redistribute a lot of funds and to run programs directly to the states, right? So we're going to see that he is going to try to gut high spending for federal programs, particularly ones that he felt had a liberal intent, and instead he redirects fundings to the states. So basically, he feels that a lot of programs should be more of a matter of state decisions rather than the federal government. And this was again an attempt to try to balance the federal budget. We also just generally see that there were some social issues that were arising in the 1960s and 70s that starts to turn the citizens in more of a conservative direction. So, for example, there was certainly a sort of mainstream reaction to the counterculture movement in the 1960s. So, as the growing hippie counterculture movement was more inclined to live, less traditional lifestyles, listen to rock music, use hallucinogenic drugs, you do see that there is a response to that that sort of argues that this counterculture is a representation of the declining morals of the country. You're also going to see in general there's going to be a contingent of conservatives that are very opposed to the Warren Court decision. So I already mentioned that Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when Brown v. Board was decided, but there are other decisions that conservatives were opposed to. So, for example, there were some criminal rights Supreme Court decisions that some conservatives don't like. One of the best examples is Gideon versus Wainwright, which was a case that supported one's constitutional right to legal representation, so the right to an attorney. That came from Gideon versus Wainwright. And when the Warren Court upheld a citizen's right to have legal representation, there were a lot of conservatives that responded negatively to that. You're also going to see that the Warren Court strikes down reading the Bible in public schools. So conservatives, many of them are going to react negatively against that. And then finally, the Warren Court made several decisions that protected one's right to privacy. The most significant case was the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which upheld abortion rights. And then also you have the Griswold versus Connecticut decision, which also supported the right to privacy by upholding one's right to have access to birth control. So again, the conservatives are not very happy with those decisions. Lastly, in general, like we said, in the 1960s, there was a widespread use of illegal drugs, and then also, rock music is increasingly prominent, so there's a conservative backlash against these changes. Again, we see that in the 1960s in particular, we know that there were increasingly radical, violent student protests, and you're going to see conservatives rise up to try to stop that. Reagan, in particular, is a huge opponent of the free speech movement. So remember that from the UC Berkeley campus, right? So Reagan, in particular, is when he runs for governor in California in 1966. He actually deliberately targets the Berkeley free speech movement. He is antagonistic towards it. A quote that I pulled from Reagan about the free speech movement is as follows. He said, "Get them out of there. Throw them out. They are spoiled and don't deserve the education they are getting. They don't have a right to take advantage of our system of education." So if you remember, the free speech advocates at Berkeley were sort of arguing that their colleges were becoming more of a bureaucratic machine, and they weren't really sort of educating students to think for themselves. And Reagan is basically deliberately challenging that and saying that student protests were a deliberate opposition to authority, and he was opposed to that. And also, Reagan, as California governor, is responsible for the dismissal or the firing of the president of the University of California system. Reagan was also majorly opposed to the sexual revolution that began in the 1960s. Remember that the birth control pill was patented in 1960, which allowed women in particular to live a more sexually free lifestyle. What Reagan argued was that when the birth control pill came out, it encouraged more promiscuous behavior. And he also said that the counterculture of the 60s and 70s were sinful, and they were representative of a general weakening of morals. Some of this shows us that Reagan is coming from an earlier generation. Reagan was older than the baby boom generation, and so there is a little bit of a disconnect between that sort of younger, more rebellious generation and Reagan. We'll see that change when Bill Clinton is elected president in 1992, because he was the first president who came from the baby boom generation. I think I already mentioned Roe v. Wade, so we can really briefly talk about this. But again, remember that there are some growing social issues that is causing conservatism to rise. So the Roe v. Wade decision, again, this legalizes abortion, and there is going to be a major conservative reaction to this, and this is going to be the beginning of the pro-life movement, which is still very much in place today, right? So basically, there are going to be increasing numbers of people that make arguments such as the idea that life begins with conception, and so people are increasingly arguing in favor of the rights of an unborn child, right? So Reagan is going to be one of the major proponents of the pro-life movement, and many conservatives will rally behind him. We also know that the gay rights movement, which started to emerge in the 1970s, is also something that a lot of conservatives will oppose. People like Reagan say that marriage was supposed to be a bond between a man and a woman, and they also argue that the federal government had no jurisdiction over redefining marriage. So basically the idea was that anyone who tried to make a move to acknowledge the idea that there could be marriages that took place between a man and a man and a woman would not be, in their mind, constitutional, because the federal government could not redefine marriage. Obviously, we know that this has changed in recent years. Increasingly, also, in general, the moral majority that arises around this time makes the argument that liberals were to blame for the decline of what they call traditional family values. So you can see this graph below shows us that starting in the 70s and moving on into the 80s, sorry, can I get that little thing to go away? Well, I mean, basically you can see that this is the late 70s, and we start to see how much the divorce rate rises. One of the reasons for the rise of the divorce rate was that something called no-fault divorces became legal. This happened in the 1960s. No-fault means that you could divorce without either party showing any significant signs of wrongdoing. So, for example, you could cite irreconcilable differences on your reason for divorce. So that means that, you know, no one has to commit adultery, no one has to actually do anything deliberately sort of abusive in a marriage to necessitate divorce proceedings. And so Reagan sort of argued against that. Ironically, Reagan actually did get divorced before he became president, so that's just something to consider. Other things that show us the rise of conservatism, again, we see that a lot of conservatives were opposed to civil rights issues that start to come up in the 1950s and 60s. Ronald Reagan himself said that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was humiliating to the South. He also opposed forced and unreasonable integration, so he was opposed to things like the busing systems that came up after the Brown v. Board decision. He sort of felt that ultimately local and state governments could take care of themselves, and it didn't seem necessary to bring the federal government in. We know that during Eisenhower and Kennedy's presidency, for example, there were several incidents where the federal guard was brought in to make sure that integration would take place. Reagan was opposed to that. He also said that affirmative action was a form of reverse discrimination. So he sort of argued that by taking minorities into things like colleges and jobs just based on their race was actually discriminatory against whites. There's certainly synthesis here because some of these arguments are coming up yet again. There was a recent Supreme Court decision about this with regard to a young white girl getting rejected from the University of Texas. She made the argument that it happened because she was white. You also start to see sort of a migration of formerly Democratic blue-collar workers starting to vote for Reagan. Some of this is because, as we know, during the stagflation days of the 1970s, more and more jobs were being outsourced, and a lot of these jobs were affecting the manufacturing sector specifically. So, you know, the deindustrialization that took place at the end of the World War II and Korea and Vietnam make a lot of blue-collar workers lose their jobs. They become increasingly disgruntled with with the politics of the 1970s, and they see Reagan as an opportunity to regain status. And so increasingly we start to see this group of people emerge that at first we called Reagan Democrats. Later they're just going to completely convert into the Republican Party. All right, so let's take a break here, and then we'll pick up with Reagan's election in 1980, and then we'll start to talk about his overall presidency.